There's a lot of talk about making a race that's truly evil to the core, about whether or not such things are acceptable. And to be fair, such a thing is a bit of a theological and moral dilemma, isn't it? I mean, Mr. Jolkien Tolkien himself grappled with that question when he made the orcs, since as a religious man, he was at odds for how to create a race that was truly evil if all in the world ultimately looped around to praising Iluvatar. But he still created them, and they're still used frequently for one simple reason. When you've got a band of plucky heroes adventuring, it's really helpful for them to have something to fight regularly. The trip to Mordor wouldn't have been nearly as interesting if it was just a walk across New Zealand with nothing happening before Mount Doom, and indeed, as much as you might like running a game of intrigue in D&D, nothing quite beats cutting your way through a horde of disposable baddies. And thus, do we have Goblinoids. Goblins, of course, included, but turns out there's a good few many of these lads across a few different species. They aren't all evil, and they do have rather interesting bits of culture and more about them, but let's be honest, viewer. If you're running a game and put goblins in it, or playing a game and your DM puts bugbears in it, I have a sneaking suspicion they're there because they're an easy thing to point at and go, kill this thing. But to reiterate, I don't think that makes them uninteresting. Everyone loves a good, reliable villain fodder to fight, and it makes it all the more exciting when they prove to be more than meets the eye. Let's look at the Goblinoids today, because even the little guys deserve their time in the sun. This will be both a bit of an overview video, both because who doesn't love hedging their bets with more content to make, and because, to be entirely honest with you viewer, an in-depth look on all these things at once is going to be my 13th reason. Unfortunately for the fine people helping with all the research on this video, I am a man of poor work ethic and great alcohol consumption. So with that in mind, let's start with the guys who give the classification of Goblinoids their name. Goblins are awful. I'm just going to start with that because there's no point pussyfooting around after an intro like that. They're small, selfish little creatures that primarily live in places almost as awful as they usually are. Ruins, especially dwarf ones, are a common place to find them. Abandoned mines are another common spot. Failing that, look long enough in a large enough cave system and you'll probably find a group of them scuttling about. These lairs tend to smell like the worst convention you've ever been to, because goblins by and large do not have a concept for something as silly as hygiene. I mean, it's only efficient, right? Just poop where you're standing, takes like 30 seconds tops that way. And why wipe your ass when you're just gonna have to go again later? But to be fair, living in a bad spot doesn't necessarily make someone a bad person. I have a friend who's repeatedly had to leave Xbox parties because there was gunfire outside his house, and I think he's at least alright. But goblins are not alright. Goblins are by and large undisciplined, weak, lazy, selfish buggers motivated by greed, spite, and the chance for revenge against some group of people or other that wronged them. And whether or not they actually wronged them is typically irrelevant. Of course, because they're a bunch of goobers, you might wonder how they get anything done. As it turns out, throw 100 of them at a problem and eventually it'll get solved through sheer weight of numbers. You never encounter one goblin unless he happens to be the world's unluckiest scout or forager. Depending on where you are, I might even say you're unlikely to encounter a handful. Goblins come by the dozen at least typically, because mathematically speaking, if you get enough of them together, eventually one of them is going to roll that natural 20 and shiv you between the eyes. This strategy is born of two simple facts. Goblins are at least aware that they're fairly weak on their own, and are utter cowards. One goblin jumping you is likely to not only fail, but result in a dead one. But 20 of them at once, like I said, is going to eventually get through. More than that, it means that chances are after the battle is won, it'll be other goblins who died in the fighting, or at least that's how a given one sees things. Their lairs reflect this fact as well, with countless different branching tunnels and traps throughout that only they know the full extent of. Stepping into one of these lairs is a good way to get yourself hurt or injured, not because you're facing a valiant force of warriors, but because, well, Goblin Slayer's a good place to start for what those horrible places look like. Checkpoints riddle the surrounding area as well, as in spite of not being the smartest folk around, goblins are cunning in a brutal way. Nearby rivers, ravines, and more will be laced with traps to catch unsuspecting travelers, because goblins love nothing more than when a plan like that comes together and they can get themselves some nice groups of slaves. Slaves, incidentally, might make up from anywhere to 10 to 40% of the members of a goblin tribe, because of course they do. Staked to a chain when they sleep and always shackled, the life of a goblin slave is a horrible one. Not that the average goblin is much better off, truth be told. Goblin society, in spite of being horrible, is actually pretty ordered. Like, to the point that a given goblin not only has an exact position in the hierarchy of a group of them, but he's aware of all the positions of the others around him as well. Presumably, this is because of the fear thing again, since if you accidentally steal from a superior, you're gonna get jumped yourself. There's 4 different castes to work with. In descending order, we've got lashers, hunters, gatherers, and pariahs. Lashers are those with a modicum of proper training in anything from military matters to something like smithing. They have actually valuable skills, if not the best of them all, and so are on top. Hunters, meanwhile, are exactly what you think, and are in addition to that the best trained at riding wolves, since wolves are one of the few creatures goblins frequently have around them. They range from almost well taken care of to horribly abused. Gatherers are again quite obvious. They gather resources, do a little farming they can, and in times of war are in charge of making poisons. Pariahs, meanwhile, are slightly misnamed since they aren't outright outcasts, but they are firmly on the bottom of the totem pole and are worked and abused by everyone above them. Mining, digging ditches and tunnels, this is the work of the pariahs. The only thing lower than them is the slaves, and even then the higher up goblins will still kick them around plenty often as if they were slaves themselves. Ruling all of this is a goblin boss. They might call themselves king or queen, but boss is a better word since they act like the world's worst shift manager ever. Symbols of authority are loved by goblins since it lets people know they're in charge, and so naturally a boss will have to themselves something like a rusty crown or a sword they stole from someone to mark their place. Bosses are in theory a hereditary position, and a given one can name a successor. But realistically, once a boss goes, it's a brief free-for-all of scheming, backstabbing, and front-stabbing until someone claims the position and order resumes. Wizards are sort of their own caste, though officially would likely be grouped in with the Lashers. Goblins are dumb. Goblins do not often have the patience to practice magic, which in D&D is oftentimes something requiring countless years of study and trials. Sorcerers who can naturally use magic are even more rare, because that's a bloodline thing, and I want you to look me dead in the eyes and say that you'd pipe this thing. Now, you ain't getting your short-stacked goblin girls in this video, buddy, you're getting these creatures. So yeah, not a lot of sorcerers either. Because of all this, whenever a goblin mage does show up, they assume that they're all the same kind of mage and indeed call them all the same thing. A booyog. Not booyah like Cyborg yells, a booyog. Sorcerer? Booyog. Wizard? Booyog. Warlock? Booyog, baby. It's booyog all the way down. If you'd like to see what it looks like when goblins show up en masse to an area, look no further than the Stonelands of the Forgotten Realms. Goblins tend to not need to eat much, being small creatures. But they like kicking puppies to death because it makes them feel better, so when they show up, things get markedly shittier. Wherever they send up shot tends to get even worse, and when you get a place like the Stonelands, which is already kind of barren to begin with, things get bad. Wargs and direwolves circle goblin tribes, both having been tamed by hunters, and because a lone goblin is a free meal. Once enough goblins gather, they also become brave enough to take on threats larger than they. The Stonelands used to have woolly mammoths and dinosaurs. Used to. Then the goblins got peckish and assholish. And being led by a sorcerer from another plane named Hlundadim, quite the name, all of these creatures were made past tense. The ecosystem of the Stonelands was obliterated because the goblins pouring in from the rather less creatively named Goblin Marches ate everything inside of it or killed it just for fun. Which, admittedly, is something I honestly think I can only give them so much shit for, since that tends to be what happens when humanity shows up in places too. Woolly mammoths coexisted with us too, you know, as well as a whole lot of other megafauna. Then we got hungry. The Great Desert of the region once expanded, which made the goblins in the Stonelands and Marches think the world was ending, because natural processes are beyond the thought of most goblins, and so clearly the apocalypse was the only option. Thus did the goblins begin pouring into neighboring regions in a great horde, only to be stopped by a combined force of men and elves. Lord of the Rings reference. Now, there is some slight explanation for all of this, as well as a brief look at other goblins I'd like to give. As far as I understand, in Eberron, goblins are actually pretty alright. That setting is all on no one race being typecast as anything much, which is nice to see. Goblins there used to actually have a sizable empire before a race of eldritch horrors showed up and ate it, so if you want to have good goblins, there is precedent. As for the standard goblin, however, well, they have a god. They have several, but remember, overview video. This god's name is Maglubiet, which is very fun to say. Rolls off the tongue nicely. Maglubiet is a douchebag. This deity has taught his followers that the best thing to do in life is to look out for oneself. Not because he prizes a clever follower, but because when a goblin dies, they receive the honor of joining the ranks of Maglubiet's demonic legions. Honor is a strong word. Eternal torment is a better descriptor, because Maglubiet likes to wage war on everyone. He especially likes to do so against Grumsh, the god of the orcs, because there is nothing new under the sun, and if you give fantasy writers a long enough time, they will eventually recreate Gork and Mork. The difference here being that unlike Warhammer, they don't love to fight each other. They actually just despise the other and always claim that they're the best, though since dying a true death in D&D's Hells is damn near impossible, all these fights tend to amount to nothing in particular happening other than the suffering for those dead goblin souls, because I imagine the orcs there at least are having some amount of fun. Because of this, mortal goblins try to put off dying as much as possible, and you could argue their cruel behavior is at least in part a defense mechanism. If you stab everyone before they get a chance to stab you, you're extending your life as much as possible, so Maglubiet doesn't get his hands on your soul faster. Whether or not he made goblins all be assholes is admittedly an open question at best and speculation at the least, but they were at least once upon a time mostly confined to the Feywilds. Thing is that they used to have more gods. Then Maglubiet showed up and conquered them, and started tossing goblins across whatever plane he could reach. He taught them to fear him, and they make up the bulk of his legions, both in the material and immaterial world. Though, admittedly, a goblin crusade looks more like a cross between a horde of rats and the world's most unhygienic alleyway mugging you've ever seen. Goblins suck. They're just awful. But 3 paths lie ahead of you, dear viewer. The first is to use goblins simply as I've described. Make them awful, cowardly beings that stop ever showing up after level 4 tops. The second path is to give them some more love, flesh them out and make them all not utter bastards. Do some Eberroning of things, it's a cool setting, you know? And the third path is, of course, the Goblin Slayer path. A fight against goblins shouldn't be every party member cosplaying as the Doomslayer, it should be a trip into a nightmare. Winding tunnels that collapse the moment you trigger a trap, endless hidden run attacks. Goblins are weak, and when they're caught, they're going to die. Which is why when your players get cocky, the goblins aren't going to get caught. They're going to scratch, kick, trick, and poison your players until they learn some goddamn humility. I'm tempted to just say bigger goblin and anything's there, but I'm afraid Dutch will come to the US just to punch me in the throat if I do that, so instead I'll actually do my goddamn job. In fairness to myself, that is not the most inaccurate way of looking at things. But consider instead this. Take the general evil behavior of goblins and strip away the rest of their negative qualities. Give them proper intelligence, proper abilities to forge weapons and armor, understanding of tactics beyond setting up a hellhole maze of traps. Make them far bigger and stronger, not just cunning but potentially brilliant. Basically, the opposite of a goblin in all ways. That's a hobgoblin, and if you don't want to go to one of the above routes I mentioned with goblins themselves, here's a damn good way to take your players down a peg after the third cleared goblin layer that session. On the surface, they're simple. Raiders who get by way of raiding others and taking the spoils back home. But there's a deep-seated aspect of hobgoblin culture you need to understand to truly know this race, that of the personal perimeter. No, this is not all of them having immense fear of you getting a bit too close to them, it's more of a simplified way of putting how they view their society and their place in their tribes. The moment they can understand language, young hobgoblins are taught of the personal perimeter. What it means essentially is this. On your own, a hobgoblin can do X, Y, and Z. They'll have whatever area they individually can scrape together to call home. 2 hobgoblins can make a much bigger personal perimeter. One can scout out threats and forage, while the other can set traps and defenses up. 4 hobgoblins can make a much bigger one than that, and so on and so forth until you get a whole tribe of them. That is the personal perimeter. It is the hobgoblin's area and home, and the disciplined lifestyle that goes into ensuring they can both claim and keep their tribe's perimeter. With this drilled into their heads from a young age, this creates a society of warriors who are trained, disciplined, and willing to do whatever it takes to ensure their personal perimeter holds strong, for if it does, then their tribe will be strong. They all share the same one, and so betrayal is largely non-existent. After all, stabbing a fellow in the back means the perimeter shrinks, for their skills can no longer go into keeping those borders secure. Though they are nomadic by nature and oftentimes get resources by raiding, they're also constantly on the defensive. The moment you leave somewhere like the Sword Coast in D&D, things tend to get rapidly shittier after all, so they need to be on the lookout for threats. There's no room for mercy in their lives, no room for much compassion, no room even for philosophy and ruminating on things. Only training and securing more to ensure the perimeter holds. Hobgoblins live in a society built for war, but not one of conquest. One of holding the line against all threats, perceived or otherwise, because the falter is for the perimeter to shrink, and that simply cannot be allowed. Naturally, of such a species, skills on the battlefield are the most respected. Their relationship with something like honor is a bit strange, however. Like I said, mercy and morality have no place in their society, so they use whatever dirty tricks they have to win. Dying on the battlefield also isn't a glorious thing to seek out, especially because they too end up in Maglubiet's grasp upon death. But they also will honor the deaths of any hobgoblin who ended up dying, because they gave their lives for the perimeter and should be thanked for it. They have 3 distinct castes in their society, with military of course being the largest one. It's what you'd expect, so I won't dwell on it too much for this video. The smallest is the religious caste, and though they're rarely the outright leaders of a given tribe, they are the ones who guide it at the end of the day. The hobgoblin connections to the divine and the ones in charge of a tribe's spiritual health, they do what they can to guide their people. This is usually where you'll find anything from sorcerers and wizards to clerics and paladins, though sometimes an assassin sneaks into their ranks since, hey, stabbing a guy in the back is a perfectly valid way to ensure the perimeter's secure. They rarely exercise official power, but they can veto a given hobgoblin warlord's decision if they feel the need. The craftsman and laborer class, however, is where I feel their differences from normal goblins truly shine. They're genuinely experts at what they do. Hobgoblin blacksmiths can make masterwork swords, for example. Because they're largely nomadic raiders, however, however, this has also turned them into expert recyclers. Captured materials are expertly turned into arms, armor, and building materials as needed by the band. They still receive military training, of course, but Hobgoblins know that having a dedicated group of people for actual productive enterprises beyond building traps and hunting is a great thing to have. For example, in spite of rarely farming themselves, they'll oftentimes be knowledgeable on it and other subjects in order to make captives do it for the Hobgoblins. Not a breath is wasted in their society, and if a talent can be proven useful, the Hobgoblins will find a way to ensure your talents are put to use. It's oddly nice, isn't it? The ultimate meritocracy. Not a good one. They are raiders and slavers still, but there is little to no prejudice within Hobgoblin society. Hell, even if you just happen to be really good at knitting, odds are eventually a Hobgoblin man will end up somewhere cold. You bet your ass they'll all be thankful for the Hobgoblin who makes the comfiest sweaters and ensure that one gets the finest choice of meat when the time comes. Their society beyond that follows much the same as I've said. Strictly disciplined from birth to death, they train and practice their craft all the time. Primarily they eat meat and so hunters are prized, but they are omnivores, and again, if they raid a village during harvest season, those knowledgeable in the matter will happily be given all the time they need to gather the crops and take them back home. And it should be said that they are lawful evil, and I'd argue that depending on the Hobgoblin tribe in question, emphasis should be placed on lawful rather than evil. They will oftentimes sell their services out as mercenaries to a given faction of another race. After all, why constantly raid human settlements when you can find a wealthy one, offer to protect it for a fee, and then they both feed and pay you? It's a matter of economy and safety, really. Buying weapons and armor means that you don't need to kill anyone to get it, plus they'll keep selling you more if you don't burn down the place they make all their stuff in. They won't suffer other Hobgoblin tribes in their area, however. As far as they're concerned, a human settlement they're working with is part of their perimeter. Other Hobgoblin groups aren't potential ways to expand their own, they're moments where another perimeter is encroaching on theirs. Thus do Hobgoblins frequently war with each other, to the point that I'd argue they most properly go to outright war with each other rather than the simple raids they do on others. When they do so, everything is utilized. Remember, for example, they're perfectly fine with spellcasters, so magically enchanted war drums that project both sonic blasts and inspire fear will be flying left, right, and center. That, incidentally, is how I imagine Hobgoblins are so good at raiding. It's all well and good to say that you can simply handle one of their attacks, but the moment the giant red goblin breaks out the drum of making you shit your pants, I assume fighting back properly becomes a bit more challenging. Aside from all that, they're very collectivist, as I've also been saying. Still though, they do have some pride, and to insult a Hobgoblin is to almost immediately get into a fight. All of them, from craftsmen to mages to warriors, are proud of themselves and their clan. To insult any of them is to insult all of them. The slight will be paid. Chances are, it'll be paid in blood, so don't smack talk them unless you either have a plan or really you want to expedite how quickly you meet your patron deity. When Maglubiet goes to war, and no, I still haven't gotten sick of saying that name, they form the core leadership of his legions. Expertly trained Hobgoblin spirits push forth the goblins into battle, and oftentimes they train them outside of such frequently demonic battles. They are the officers, the generals of his legions, and they shall know no fear, for to do so is to face the shame of one's perimeter shrinking as you shirk your duty. Glory is rewarded not because it's something they seek out, but because notable actions are to be commended and rewarded for going above and beyond the line of duty. Thus do the Hobgoblins hold their line by whatever means necessary. The actual necessity of it is arguable, since at the end of the day they don't quite need to be raiders. There could be other options, but none can doubt their fortitude and their willingness to die for what they believe is their only way of life. Look at that, now that we're on Bugbears, I can finally stop accidentally writing just Goblin in the script because they actually have a different name than adding Hob to the front of Goblin. Thank Christ. Bugbears suck in much the same way Goblins suck, I won't lie to you. They're rare, thankfully, but greatly territorial creatures that tend to prefer ambushes and stalking remote but traveled roads at night. Unfortunately, though they share much the same cruelties the average goblin does, they have one thing that makes them infinitely more threatening. They're ripped, dude. I heard bugbears are shredded, that bugbears have an 8-pack. Usually standing 7 to 8 feet tall, bugbears are well named. They can rip you to shreds if need be, and legends tell countless stories of bugbears descending on wary travelers to consume them. This isn't true, actually. Oh, they'll kill you to be sure and then take your head, but they don't need people. They just like to spook people a bit, and turns out ripping someone's head off before disappearing into the night is a great way to scare people. Their long, sharp claws and fangs coupled with their tough hides also help these matters, as is the fact they're a lot more dexterous than you might think. If it helps you visualize things, imagine getting jumped by Wolverine after he hasn't shaved for 100 years. It's basically that, coupled with the Maroon 5 playing in the background and everything. They're a lot more solitary than goblins, since by virtue of being strong as hell, they don't need to gather in numbers to stay safe and threaten others. They'll still form packs, but much smaller ones than the hundreds of goblins you'll find by lifting the wrong rock. They're still quite lazy and hedonistic, however, to the point that aside from food, the favorite thing they love to steal is wine and ale. Which, you know what? I opened this video by talking about drinking too much. Fair play, Bugbears. Perhaps we're more of kindred spirits than I'd care to admit. They really are just stronger goblins in a lot of ways and act exactly like that given the fact they know that's what they are. They take plenty of slaves so they can spend most of their time napping or doing whatever random crap they feel like. They operate at least partially like gangs with their familial groups, because a bugbear making you an offer you can't refuse tends to be a lot more immediately violent than most other gangs would make you. You can pay them and they might work for you, they are sapient, but they're also selfish, treacherous bastards who will happily jump ship at the first sign of trouble, or the other guy offering them more money. Or again, because they're rampagingly hedonistic, because they felt like wandering off to go crank their hogs instead. They're certainly braver than goblins, it must be said, but I also assume that at least part of that is because they're stronger than 90% of things out there. It's easy to be brave when you can rip a dude apart like an angry Wookiee. Even their weaker members are perfectly capable of surviving on their own. Sometimes tensions boil in a given gang of bugbears, and some might be cast off. Usually, they just wander on their own for a while before eventually finding another group of bugbears to join, and they get back to what they normally do: taking slaves and sitting around in a drunken stupor. Ambush predators extraordinaire they truly are, as well as God's laziest bastards. At least they don't attack kids or lone travelers too often, mostly because it's not worth the heat it'll bring down, but hey, it's a standard they have, that's something. Aside from Mr. Magoo himself, they actually have two other gods they worship as well. Hruguk is the elder sibling, one they believe gave them their incredible strength and bravery. Grankol is the one who gave them the ability to be stealthy and sneaky, but also made them tired all the time, so they totally have to go take a nap right now, and they totally aren't just lazy bastards. I mean, in theory, Grankol's always on alert for them, but this also to me sounds like the religious version of a dad saying he's not asleep, he's just resting his eyes. When Mungle Bungle grabs all the Goblinoids for war, however, the Bugbears form both the shock troops and assassins of his armies. He's already got the core choices of goblins covered, and the elites in the form of Hobgoblins, so Bugbears fill in the gaps where either a brief display of incredible violence is needed, or a knife in the dark is the way to go. They even believe that when this happens, Maglubiet is corralling their other two brother gods into a battle, so they actually join these religious wars happily. They also don't have priests or worship, because they can very easily tell if one of their gods is angry. If Grankol's angry, they suddenly go blind and deaf. If Hruguk is angry, they just get struck by lightning, which is so funny to me. I mean, like, yeah, I guess it's a good way to know God's upset with you. Could have probably used a bit of warning before that, but hey, I'm not Hruguk and they still seem content with them, so like, go off, I guess. There's also a third god named Skigaret. He's an asshole, and when a bugbear feels like they're in danger, they enter a berserk and manic panic, where Skigaret takes control and causes them to flip the hell out. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think this guy is real. I think this is an explanation they have for why they went apeshit during a robbery gone wrong. As a bonus, since those were the big three Goblinoid races, here's a few subspecies of them to briefly ponder. Coelith are hobgoblins but in the water. They speak a funny version of hobgoblin language and are a bit more lithe, but they're water hobgoblins. Zendikar goblins, meanwhile, are a lot nicer than normal goblins, but make up for that by still being cowards and by having a critical lack of anything resembling common sense. They like exploring areas other races would balk at so much as looking at, because hey, there might be neat stuff in there. There's a lot more shamans and wizards amongst them as well, who mostly prefer fire and lightning spells because big explosions and big lightning tickles their brains, which is an attitude I can respect. They also like to eat magically charged rocks, since it makes them more resistant to the various effects of the Eldrazi, because kiss my ass, you're getting Magic the Gathering lore today too. There's three main clans of Zendikar goblins. The Grotag tribe are exceptionally stupid, but there seems to be a never-ending supply of them, so when they keep crawling over places they really shouldn't be, they've ended up accumulating a surprisingly vast collection of knowledge and lore. They also keep getting eaten by monsters because they keep trying to tame the monsters. Not even for nefarious warbeast purposes, they just want to pet the cute puppy, even if the cute puppy is 90% teeth by volume. The Lava Steppe tribe is industrious and good at working with crystals, though I assume given their name they have no small amount of the numbers who died by... well, taking the name a bit too literally, as it were. And then we have the Tuk Tuk tribe, who sell their services as ruin explorers. These guys are actually dicks, though, because they usually just try to steal random artifacts for whoever they're guiding can, and then trigger every trap they can on the way out. Assholes. Planeshift Ixalan goblins are basically pirate monkeys. They're pranksters, though not usually outright malicious, live in the jungle, and have prehensile tails. Not really sure what was happening with the guy who wrote them. Neat, I guess. And lastly, we have a goblin subspecies called Norkers. I'm going to call them Norks because holy fuck, Wizards of the Coast, what the hell is that? They're particularly cruel, lazy, vicious goblins who only haven't been exterminated en masse by hobgoblins because Maglubiet doesn't allow them to do so. Jesus Christ, this is awful. That's enough for me now. And on that lovely note, that was the Goblinoids of D&D. Nice little entry point for them, since I'm sure the hyperfixation will hit one day and I'll want to talk about just goblins or hobgoblins one day. Maybe not bugbears, but I feel that's fitting. Why should I take time out of my schedule of masturbating and drinking all day when bugbears wouldn't do it for me either? As always, if you wouldn't mind, liking, commenting, and subscribing is greatly appreciated. And if not, still, thank you for watching, take care out there, and have a good one.